Alright, so welcome to my project. We're going to start with the conditioning phase, which is 2 weeks. And so basically what my project is I will be making a 6-week powerlifting program that will take the user through each phase of a program, which is the conditioning phase, the muscular hypertrophy slash strength phase, and then the full-on strength phase. So how we get there is that from the beginning phase, we use a lot of assistance movements that are not entirely specific to the three compound movements, which is squat, bench, and deadlifts, along with the squat, bench, and deadlift and variations of the squat, bench, and deadlift to focus on weaknesses in those certain movements. So to summarize, these 2 weeks of the program will be to accumulate some conditioning, which basically means that we have to get the muscles used to high frequency, and then as we get further into the program, we can lessen the frequency and then up the weight. And since we have a foundation from which we created endurance, then we can add more weight to it since our body is more accustomed to these weights. This is an important phase in any program because it's important to understand that we can't go into maximal weights and maximal effort without creating a foundation of hypertrophy. You have to grow the muscles and you have to attack the weaknesses in these movements to be able to move maximal weight. For example, here on the first day of the conditioning phase, I made a point to work up to a heavy paused single on the squat. Normally you wouldn't pause the reps on a squat, but on this particular day I decided that I would be doing pause squats to focus on not using the stretch reflex at the bottom of the squat. So it's things like those that in the conditioning phase we also want to focus on. It's not only building up conditioning and building up endurance in those muscles, but also taking those little weaknesses that we have in the compound lifts and strengthening them. So like I said, since I use the stretch reflex a lot in the squat, I made a point to put pause squats in it, to have a little pause at the bottom of the squat to not rely so heavily on that stretch reflex. For those who aren't familiar with the stretch reflex, I will be making a video that is a tutorial on how to perform the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, and in the squat one I will explain exactly what the stretch reflex is. So my project is basically, along with the 6-week program, which will have 2 weeks per phase, the conditioning, the muscular hypertrophy slash strength phase, and the full-on strength phase. I will also be making tutorials on each of the main compound movements, squat, bench, and deadlift, to show how to properly perform these and how they actually work physiologically. What I also further wish to achieve with these video journals is to explain the thought process that goes behind programming certain movements and how this will eventually help me build a stronger 1 rep max for each of the competition lifts. So yeah, that's the skeleton of my project, and basically the way I will be able to test if this program is effective is naturally by testing the competition lifts after those 6 weeks and work up to a 1 rep max and see if it's increased since the last time I attempted my 1 rep max. So yeah, that's my project, and if you would like, you can stay tuned on my commentary of why I included certain movements in this week of training. This is the first week of the conditioning phase. This particular day we were doing squat and bench, and we're trying to get around 3 days of pressing and 3 days of squatting. This will give us enough frequency to be able to have built a good enough foundation for endurance as we further progress in the program. It's also important to attack different areas of these same compound lifts. So I did incline as well as overhead press and floor press for bench, as they attack different things in the bench press. The incline press will attack the upper chest along with the shoulders. The overhead press also with the shoulders. Shoulders seem to be a weakness in my bench press, so I decided it would be a good idea to tackle that, as well as keeping vertical, perpendicular forearms, which is very important in the bench, and I'll explain that more in the tutorial I make. But quite simply, having perpendicular forearms to the floor will optimize how much weight you can push in the bench. Okay, so on this particular day, we were doing a variation of the bench called Larsen press, which is when you take the feet off the ground, and this is basically to take away that support that the leg drive gives us, and I will explain that more in a bench tutorial on why that is so crucial to the bench press. But basically, it takes away that help that having the feet planted on the floor give, therefore isolating the muscles that push the bench and really making sure that my forearm is in check and is on point. On this particular day, we were doing close grip of that variation. And basically what close grip does is it puts an emphasis on the roll of the triceps, and it isolates them a little bit, and it really makes you focus on packing in the lats, which is also really important in the bench press, because if the lats aren't packed back tight, then you have the possibility of your elbows flaring out. And I will explain more in depth how this is a setback in my bench tutorial. Afterwards, we moved on to deadlifts, and we worked up to a paused single of 425 at an RP of 7. For those who don't know what RPE stands for, it stands for rate of perceived exertion, and it's basically a way that we can gauge the difficulty of a certain movement. So if I said it was an RPE of 7, it means that I would have had 3 more reps left in the tank. Lifters usually use this way of measuring and gauging how difficult something was to not burn themselves out, and doing weights at an appropriate percentage that will leave room for improvement and won't entirely fatigue the lifter. And after the heavy single, we moved to back down paused 5s at 365, which is around 70%, I think, and it was an RP6, so I would have had 4 reps left in the tank of each set. Basically, the reason behind including paused sumo deadlift is that starting position in the sumo is very, very important. For most people, sumo is very slow off the ground, and it's important to emphasize that so that the positioning and how much the butt is sat down and how much the glutes are engaged at the beginning are, because if you don't focus on how much the glutes are engaged, then you have a possibility of falling forward. As said before, I will be going more in depth on this in a tutorial. Afterwards, I did some wide grip Romanian deadlifts, which is basically to target those lats and target the posterior chain and send some blood to that area to strengthen it. It's basically just to create some hypertrophy in that area that needs strengthening. Assistance is especially crucial in building up compound lifts because it takes the weaknesses that you have in that certain compound lifts and it strengthens those muscles that aren't as strong. And finally, we finished off with front squats, which really emphasizes on opening up the hips as it does sumo deadlift, and also emphasizes on the engagement of the lats as to not fall over, because it's really important to have your lats engaged, to hold that weight in the proper position, and have a straight vertical line as a bar path.
And people are pretty readily accepted as well. I mean, it was a decision made very early on, I think, by all of us that it wasn't going to be this hierarchical system, and where certain
On this day, we worked up to a set of 8 with 315 at an appropriate RP, and then had back down 8s with an appropriate RP as well. As I said before, these sets are basically to build up muscle in the areas that need focus in the squat by doing the squat. So we would have reps within the range of 12 and 6 for more hypertrophic results, and then from 6 to 1 for more strength results, which we'll be moving into as we gradually move along the program. So the way we want to look at a program, quoting Alan Thal, is like a pyramid. At the bottom, we have a foundation built by a ton of hypertrophy and a ton of, not endurance, but muscular endurance work, which is used with weights with high reps. And as we gradually get closer and closer to our goal date, which we set to hit our 1 rep maxes, we take away the assistance more and more, and we get more specific, and we work on those compound lifts more specifically than we would have at the beginning. So let's say I programmed Romanian deadlifts on the first 2 weeks in the conditioning phase. I wouldn't be doing that in the strength phase because we wouldn't need the assistance anymore, and we would be needing to focus solely on the deadlift. When working with rep ranges and in like 4 to 1 and percentages of 85 to 90, this will be very taxing on the central nervous system, and one cannot afford to include needless assistance at this point. By the time you've reached the strength phase, you want to have already attacked those weaknesses in the conditioning phase, so you can lift heavier weights. If you don't, it'll show. You'll quite possibly have a break in technique and not be able to lift as maximal loads as you would have wanted to.
I'm not going to mention those just quite yet because I'm not sure what order they're going to be able to come out in. But sleeves will be next, obviously. Put down.
As well as this being the 3rd day of doing any squatting movement, this is also our 3rd day of pressing. So we work up to a set of 9 at the appropriate RP, which in this case was 180, and then we work at back downs. Again, this is all for muscular hypertrophy to create that foundation to be able to lift stronger things as the program progresses. There was supposed to be a 4th day in which we were supposed to work up to a set of deadlifts, but on that day I was feeling particularly fatigued, so I decided for the next week to rearrange the way that we would perform these days. So on the first day we would have squat and bench. On the second day we would have close grip and deadlift. On the 3rd day, which would be a Friday, which would have been this Friday a week later, would be just bench press and bench variation. And then on Saturday we would do a squat, bench, and deadlift, so that we would have recuperated and not been so fatigued for those leg exercises. So this was our first week of the conditioning phase, and it honestly showed a pretty promising start. We had some pretty good sets on both squat and bench, as well as getting some good pause work on the deadlift to really emphasize breaking off the floor.